The morning sun of May 19, 1643, rises over a slaughterhouse. The battlefield of Rocroi, in northern France, is a chaos of smoke, blood, and panic. The invincible Spanish army of Flanders, the most feared and respected land force in Europe for over a century, is broken. Its cavalry has been annihilated. Its flanks have collapsed, and entire regiments are fleeing in disarray. The air is filled with the screams of the wounded and the roar of French cannons consuming the fugitives. The French victory is total, crushing, historic. But amidst the carnage, in the center of the field, something defies the logic of defeat. 5 infantry formations remain motionless, like rocks against a tide of steel. They are the last tercios, an island of 5,000 men, a forest of 5-meter pikes, and the glint of muskets ready to fire. Surrounded by an ocean of 30,000 victorious Frenchmen, they refuse to flee, refuse to surrender, refuse to die on their knees. These men are the heirs to a tradition of relentless warfare, veterans of countless campaigns who know nothing but duty and honor. For them, the battle is not over. As long as their flag still stands and a single man can hold a pike, the fight continues. What is about to happen is no longer a battle for victory, but a ritual sacrifice for the glory of a fading empire. This is not the story of how Spain lost a battle. It is the final testament, written in blood and gunpowder, of the military unit that dominated the world for 150 years. It is the chronicle of the last day of the old tercios, the infantry that had conquered kingdoms and terrified its enemies from Italy to Flanders. Rocroi was not their end, it was their apotheosis. The story of how, when all was lost and death was the only certainty, 5,000 men defied an entire army and forged a legend of courage so pure and so terrible that it eclipsed the defeat itself, teaching their conquerors an unforgettable lesson on the true meaning of honor. Commanding this legendary infantry was a ghost from the past, the Maistre de Campo Paul Bernard de Fontaine. He was a 70-year-old Walloon veteran, so weathered by war that gout and old wounds had crippled him, forcing him to be carried in a sedan chair. His physical presence was a perfect symbol of the tercios themselves, old, inflexible, experienced, and utterly stubborn. Fontaine represented unwavering discipline and tradition. Above him, the army's commander-in-chief, Don Francisco de Mello, was a competent but cautious general, a man who trusted in the proven tactics of the past. Unable to imagine that the rules of war were about to be rewritten in the most brutal fashion by a much younger and bolder adversary. The core of his force was composed of the Spanish tercios, unanimously considered the best and toughest infantry in the world. They were hardened professionals, many of them veterans of the 30 Years' War, for whom battle was a trade. They were supported by equally experienced units of Italians, Walloons, and Germans, all fighting under the banner of the King of Spain. Their motivation went beyond simple patriotism or pay. For a soldier of a tercio, the honor of the regiment was his soul. The flag, embroidered with the Cross of Burgundy, was a sacred object for which it was worth dying. A disorderly retreat or an unconditional surrender were unthinkable concepts. A stain of dishonor worse than death itself. Facing them was the embodiment of the future. Louis II de Bourbon, the Duc d'Enghien, was only 21 years old. He was arrogant, impetuous, brilliant, and consumed by an almost pathological hunger for glory. While Mello was a product of the old school, Enghien was a revolutionary, a gambler willing to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. He understood speed, momentum, and shock in a way his opponents could not. He knew he was facing a legend, but instead of being intimidated, he saw a unique opportunity to be the man who finally shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility. His youth and his audacity were the most dangerous weapons in the French arsenal, an unpredictable factor against the predictable and solid Spanish war machine. Enghien's army was slightly inferior in infantry numbers, but superior in cavalry. Its main advantage lay not in figures, but in the quality and doctrine of its horsemen, trained to charge home with the sword, rather than performing the more cautious firing maneuvers of their Spanish counterparts. Furthermore, his command was unified and charismatic. Enghien inspired a fanatical loyalty in his men. However, his army was, on the whole, less experienced than the Spanish, and it was in a perilous strategic position. If Enghien lost at Rocroi, the road to Paris would be open for invasion. His gamble was all or nothing. A victory would make him a hero, but a single miscalculation could mean total ruin for France. Destiny had chosen a claustrophobic stage for this clash of titans. Rocroi was an open plain, but it was flanked by dense woods and marshy terrain. This natural funnel severely limited the space for maneuver, especially for cavalry, channeling both armies into a frontal, brutal, and direct confrontation. In theory, this terrain was ideal for the Spanish tercios. Their defensive formation of pikes and muskets, almost impregnable to a frontal charge, would be favored in a battle of attrition where experience and discipline would prevail over agility. Mello, upon seeing the field, felt confident. He was about to fight exactly the kind of battle his men had won for generations, a test of endurance and raw courage. However, where Mello saw an advantage, the young Duc d'Enghien saw an opportunity. He perceived that the Spanish formation, though formidable, was rigid and predictable, a powerful but slow-moving giant. He identified a weakness on his own left flank, which he knew would likely be overcome by the superior Spanish cavalry in that sector. But instead of reinforcing it defensively, he conceived one of the most audacious and risky maneuvers in military history. He decided to sacrifice his left flank to buy time, while concentrating his best cavalry on the right, to deliver a decisive blow that would change the course of the battle in an instant. The board is set, the trap is laid. To witness how the genius of a young duke confronts the legend of the tercios, subscribe now and give a like, because you are about to witness the exact moment history changed forever. The battle began at dawn with the traditional artillery duel. Shortly after, Enghien ordered his left flank cavalry to charge. As he had anticipated, the attack was a disaster. The Spanish cavalry, superior in number and confidence in that sector, not only withstood the charge but shattered it and launched a devastating counterattack, putting the French horsemen to flight. Simultaneously, in the center, the formidable French infantry advanced, only to crash against the wall of pikes of the tercios. After a brutal hand-to-hand struggle, the French were repulsed with heavy losses. From the perspective of the Spanish commander, Francisco de Mello, the battle was unfolding according to the script. His right flank was victorious, and his center was holding firm. The initial advantage was clearly his. It was at this precise moment of apparent advantage that the fate of the Spanish army was sealed. Having defeated the French cavalry on his flank, Mello had a golden opportunity to win the battle. A decisive charge by his victorious horsemen against the exposed flank of the French infantry could have triggered a cascading collapse. But Mello hesitated. True to the cautious Spanish doctrine, he opted for prudence, ordering his cavalry to regroup rather than exploit their success. He did not want to risk his only advantage in a charge that might disorganize his troops. This decision, logical according to the manuals of the time, became the fatal error of the day. That pause, that moment of hesitation, was all the Duc d'Enghien needed. While Mello clung to a minor tactical advantage, Enghien was executing a maneuver that would redefine warfare. At the other end of the field, he had personally led the charge of his right flank cavalry, crushing the Walloon cavalry opposing him. But instead of pursuing the fleeing horsemen, as a conventional commander would have done, Enghien demonstrated his genius. He halted his men, regrouped them with iron discipline and prepared for the masterstroke, the all-or-nothing moment he had planned from the beginning. Mello's indecision had granted him the precious minutes that would turn a victory into a legend. With his elite cavalry formed up behind him, Enghien began his legendary enveloping charge. In an unprecedented maneuver, he led his squadrons not forward, but in a wide arc, riding at full speed behind the entire Spanish infantry line. He crossed the battlefield from one end to the other, a serpent of steel and dust moving across the enemy's rear. The tercio commanders in the center could not believe their eyes, but their rigid formation prevented them from turning to face this unexpected threat. They were trapped, forced to be spectators to their own destruction as the French cavalry galloped toward their vulnerable rear. The Spanish cavalry on Mello's victorious flank were still regrouping when the apocalypse fell upon them. Enghien and his horsemen emerged from the cloud of smoke and dust directly at their rear. The attack was a total and absolute surprise. Caught between the battlefront and Enghien's charge, the Spanish horsemen, who had believed themselves victorious moments before, were annihilated. The slaughter was swift and brutal. In a matter of minutes, the entire cavalry of the Spanish army was destroyed or routed. With a single, bold move, Enghien had decapitated the enemy army, leaving it without flank protection and without leadership. News of the cavalry's destruction spread like wildfire through the Spanish ranks. The support units, the German and Italian troops protecting the flanks of the tercios, saw the French cavalry enveloping them. Panic seized them. Without the protection of their own horsemen, they knew they were doomed. Their lines broke, and they began to flee the field, seeking the safety of the nearby woods. The army of Francisco de Melo, which an hour earlier seemed on the verge of victory, completely disintegrated. Melo himself fled with the remnants of his cavalry, abandoning his infantry to their fate. Amidst the total collapse, only 5 units remained on the battlefield. They were the veterans, the steel core of the army, the Spanish and Walloon tercios. They watched their allies flee, saw the French cavalry completely surround them, and understood that the battle was lost. Death or capture were the only options. But for these men, there was a third option: honor. Instead of breaking ranks and joining the rout, they did what they had been trained to do their entire lives. They grouped together into 5 perfect square formations, the bastions of pikes pointing outward, the musketeers at the corners ready to fire. They became 5 human fortresses, ready to fight to the last man. What followed was no longer a battle, but a siege. The Duc d'Enghien, now the absolute master of the field, launched his victorious cavalry against the Spanish squares. The first charge was a thunder of hooves and steel that crashed against a wall of pikes. Horses were impaled, riders fell, and point-blank musket volleys emptied saddles. The French cavalry, the best in Europe, retreated, battered. Enghien was stunned by such discipline and ferocity. He could not believe that an already defeated and hopeless infantry could resist in such a manner. The determination of the tercios was a direct challenge to his victory. A second and a third cavalry charge met the same fate. The Spanish squares held firm, a hedgehog of steel that bled but did not break. With each repulsed charge, Enghien's respect for his adversaries grew. He then ordered his infantry to join the assault, supported by the artillery he had dragged to the center of the field. The point-blank bombardment began to open bloody gaps in the ranks of the tercios, but the survivors simply closed ranks over the bodies of their fallen comrades, keeping the formation intact. The discipline was superhuman, a testament to 150 years of military supremacy. The commander of the tercios, the elderly Paul Bernard de Fontaine, directed the defense from his sedan chair in the center of one of the squares. Surrounded by his men, he became the epicenter of the resistance. A musket volley finally struck him, killing him instantly. He died as he had always lived, on the battlefield, surrounded by his soldiers, fighting to his last breath. His death did not break his men's morale. On the contrary, it inspired them to fight with even greater fury to avenge their fallen leader. They had become a force of nature, a monument to resistance. Even after the death of their commander, the tercios continued to fight. They repelled a 4th massive assault, a combination of infantry and cavalry. By then, the original 5 squares had been reduced by casualties, merging into 1 or 2 smaller but equally defiant groups. The field around them was covered with the bodies of French and Spanish. The Duc d'Enghien, observing the carnage, realized he was sacrificing his best men to annihilate an enemy that was already beaten. The bravery of the Spanish was so sublime that continuing the massacre seemed almost a sacrilege, an act unworthy of his great victory. The sun began to descend in the sky, and the tercios were still there, a bloodied but indomitable remnant. They had lost the battle, but they were winning immortality. Their resistance had transformed a simple military defeat into an epic of courage that would be told for centuries. Enghien, the young and brilliant conqueror, found himself in a strange position. He had won the Battle of Rocroi, but now he had to find a way to end the legend being forged before his very eyes, a legend that threatened to make his victory seem pyrrhic and brutal. The carnage of Rocroi was appalling. When the smoke finally cleared, it revealed a field covered by thousands of bodies. The Spanish army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. It suffered around 7,000 casualties, of which some 3,000 were killed and 4,000 captured. But the most shocking statistic was the fate of the elite Spanish tercios. They were practically annihilated. Of the nearly 5,000 men who formed the final squares, very few survived. They chose death before dishonor, and they found it. The cream of the Spanish infantry, the force that had been the backbone of Habsburg power, lay dead in the mud of Rocroi. The fate of the commanders reflected the outcome of the battle. The old lion, Paul Bernard de Fontaine, died as a true maître de campo at his command post, fighting alongside his men to the end. His body was found among a pile of corpses, a silent testament to his unbreakable valor. In contrast, the commander-in-chief, Francisco de Melo, the man whose hesitation had cost the battle, managed to escape the field with the remnants of his cavalry. He survived to face disgrace and trial for one of the most catastrophic defeats in Spanish history, an inglorious end for a commander who did not measure up to the courage of his men. However, the French victory was not cheap. The Duc d'Enghien lost around 4,000 men, killed and wounded. It was a terribly high number of casualties for the victorious army, a clear indication of the ferocity of the fighting, and, in particular, the incredible resistance of the tercios. The Spanish squares, even in their death throes, had inflicted terrible punishment on their assailants. The Battle of Rocroi was no military parade for the French. It was a fight to the death that cost them a significant portion of their best troops. The legend of the tercios was written not only with their own blood, but also with that of their enemies. The military impact of Rocroi was immediate and profound. The battle shattered the myth of the invincibility of the Spanish tercios, an aura they had maintained for a century and a half. Since the Battle of Pavia in 1525, no force had been able to defeat the Spanish infantry in a large-scale pitched battle. Rocroi demonstrated that the tercio formation, though still formidable defensively, had become too slow and rigid for the modern battlefield. Enghien's bold combination of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, based on speed, flexibility, and audacious leadership, heralded the dawn of a new era in the art of war. The old way of fighting died with Fontaine's men. Politically, Rocroi marked a decisive turning point in European history. It signaled the end of Spanish military hegemony and the beginning of France's rise as the continent's leading land power. Although Spanish power would take decades to decline completely, the defeat at Rocroi was the symbolic blow from which it would never recover. France, under the young King Louis XIV, and with generals like Enghien, who would become known as the Great Condé, would dominate the battlefields of Europe for the next century. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and the change had been cemented on the bloody field of Rocroi. Over time, the battle became a symbol of the end of an era. Just as the Battle of Agincourt marked the end of the medieval knight, Rocroi represented the death of the Renaissance soldier, personified by the Spanish pikeman. The image of the tercios, alone in the center of the field, fighting to extinction, became a powerful metaphor for the decline of the Spanish Empire, proud, defiant, and glorious even in its fall. The battle passed into history not just as a French victory, but as the funeral of the most successful military formation of its time, a requiem for a way of understanding war and honor. Ironically, the most crushing defeat of the tercios became their greatest legend. The story of their last stand transcended the outcome of the battle. It became a foundational myth about courage, discipline, and sacrifice. The image of those men choosing to die together under their flag, rather than surrender, has been celebrated in literature, painting, and military history as the ultimate example of martial valor. By refusing to accept defeat, the men of Rocroi achieved a moral victory that resonated far more strongly than their tactical failure. They became immortal not in spite of their defeat, but because of it. After 4 massive and failed assaults against the last Spanish square, and seeing his best soldiers dying uselessly against that wall of pikes and determination, the Duc d'Enghien halted the attack. He was astonished. Never in his young life had he witnessed such a display of bravery. These men were not fighting for victory, which they knew was impossible. They were not fighting for their lives, which they already considered lost. They were fighting for something intangible, for the honor of their flag and the soul of their regiment. The carnage no longer made military sense. To continue the assault would be to stain his glorious victory with the massacre of heroes. Moved by a profound respect, he decided to do something unusual. He sent an officer to offer the survivors a surrender with the highest honors of war. This meant they would not be treated as humiliated prisoners. They would be allowed to march off the battlefield with their weapons, their flags flying, and to the beat of their drums, as if they were a victorious army. It was the ultimate tribute a victor could pay to the vanquished. But the Spanish, distrustful, proud, and ready to die, believed it was a trap. Their response to the offer of peace was a close-range musket volley that struck down the French officer. It took Enghien himself to approach, risking his life, to offer the terms a second time. Only then, convinced of their adversary's genuine respect, did the last veterans of the Tercio accept. They did not surrender. They simply agreed to stop fighting, not as a defeated army, but as warriors who had won the soul of their conquerors.